The story of Solomon is usually told with clean lines. A gifted young king inherits a fragile throne, asks for wisdom instead of wealth, and becomes the ruler whose name turns into a proverb. In that familiar telling, the temple rises like a final answer to Israel's wandering, stone replacing tents, order replacing uncertainty, one sacred center replacing scattered altars. But the older you read, the more the lines begin to blur. Solomon did not reign in a vacuum. He ruled a small kingdom pressed between empires, alive because it learned to speak the language of larger powers without being swallowed by them. His Jerusalem sat on the ridge roads that linked Egypt to the north, the desert to the sea. Merchants, envoys, and craftsmen moved through his gates like seasons, bringing cedar and gold, purple cloth and carved ivory, foreign songs and foreign prayers. Israel's scriptures remember him as a man who built two worlds at once. One world was public, official, almost liturgical. It was the world of the temple, the deliberate architecture, the ordered priesthood, the calendar of offerings that turned time itself into worship. This world claimed exclusivity. It claimed that Israel's God was not one God among many, not a local spirit competing for attention, but the one whose covenant demanded a singular loyalty. The temple in that vision was more than a building. It was a statement against the religious geography of the ancient Near East, where every hill could be holy and every city had its divine patron. Solomon's other world was private, political, and human. It was the world of treaties and tribute, of ports and caravans, of royal marriages and court intrigues. It was the world that kept the kingdom rich and stable. It was also the world where religion could never be merely personal. Because in Solomon's age, gods were not simply believed in, they were hosted. To modern ears, the phrase foreign worship can sound like an abstract category, like a theological error described in a book. But in the Iron Age, worship was embodied. It arrived in the form of objects and people, amulets worn under clothing, small figurines tucked into household corners, priests and attendants who knew how to keep a cult alive, singers who carried hymns across borders. A god did not travel as an idea alone. A god traveled with ritual memory, with gestures, with the smell of incense, with the shape of an altar. And the palace was the most porous place of all. Solomon's court was not only a seat of power, it was an instrument of diplomacy. Royal marriages were alliances written in flesh. They created blood ties across borders, obligations that could outlast a treaty. They also imported entire worlds of expectation. A princess from a coastal city did not become an Israelite peasant. She arrived with her retinue, her customs, her language, her sense of what it meant to honor the powers that had guarded her childhood. A daughter of Moab or Ammon carried the weight of her people's story, and those stories were interwoven with the names of their gods. The biblical memory later condenses all of this into a sentence that feels almost too simple. Solomon loved many foreign women. It is a line that can be read as scandal or as politics or as both. But beneath it lies a historical reality scholars recognize across the ancient Near East. Kings married for strategy, and strategy came with religion attached. In the courts of Egypt, Hatti and the city-states of the Levant, diplomacy was often sealed by marriage, and the religious identity of the bride was not erased at the gate. A royal household could contain multiple cultic practices, some quiet, some official, some tolerated for the sake of peace. Israel's tradition, however, frames this as danger from the beginning, not because it denies the reality of international marriage, but because it insists that covenant loyalty cannot be divided without consequences. The tension is already present in the way Solomon's reign is remembered. In the same breath, the texts celebrate his grandeur and hint at unease. They describe wealth so vast it becomes surreal. Gold measured in heaps, silver treated as common, exotic animals and luxury goods arriving through trade. They describe administrative genius, districts, officers, storage cities, chariot towns, the machinery of a state that has learned to extract and organize. But they also allow shadows to collect in the corners of that brightness. The temple is built on a hill in Jerusalem, but the land is full of other hills. The central sanctuary claims to gather all worship into one place, yet the habits of local altars do not vanish overnight. High places existed long before Solomon and long after him, local shrines and sacred sites where offerings were made. Some may have been devoted to Israel's God outside Jerusalem's oversight. Others almost certainly hosted mixed practices. Archaeology, too, has complicated the old picture of a uniformly centralized religion. Household cult objects, regional shrines, and the persistence of non-centralized ritual patterns suggest that Israelite religion in practice was often more diverse than reformers wished it to be. This is not an argument against the biblical narrative. It is the very world in which that narrative makes sense. Because the biblical authors are not naive. They know how porous religion can be. They know how a nation can claim one thing while living another. Their condemnation of Solomon is not simply moral outrage. It is political theology. The belief that a nation's covenant identity is bound to its survival, and that betrayal of that identity produces fracture. So what does it mean, then? When the tradition accuses Solomon not merely of permitting foreign worship, but of building places for it. The claim is extraordinary. Not that foreign rights existed in the land, but that royal hands legitimized them. Constructing shrines associated with deities of neighboring peoples, placing them within sight of Jerusalem, near the very temple that was supposed to stand as Israel's singular sacred center. The memory is not of a king who lost control, but of a king who used power to domesticate what should have remained outside. Here the language of Scripture becomes sharp. It does not say Solomon abandoned the temple. It says his heart turned. In ancient Israelite thought, the heart is not only emotion, it is will, loyalty, and the deep inner alignment of a person. The accusation is interior. It suggests that Solomon maintained the outward forms while surrendering something inward, perhaps gradually, perhaps rationally, perhaps under the pressure of affection and politics. That is why the story is so unsettling. It is not about a man who openly declares a new God and tears down the old sanctuary. It is about a man who keeps the house of God shining while quietly opening doors elsewhere. To understand how such secrecy could exist, you have to picture the geography of power. A temple is public. It has priests, schedules, and crowds. Its rituals are performed in the open air of communal life, regulated and remembered. A palace is different. A palace is controlled access. It is corridors and courtyards, inner chambers and guarded terraces. It is a place where a few people can do something, and the rest of the city may never know the details. It is also a place where the line between personal devotion and political concession can disappear. In a royal compound, a private altar could be framed as courtesy. A shrine built for a foreign queen could be framed as respect. A ritual performed quietly could be framed as harmless. And as the court normalized these concessions, what once would have sounded like apostasy could be softened into something that felt civilized, cosmopolitan, even wise. Solomon's reputation for wisdom makes the danger deeper. A foolish king can be condemned easily. A wise king can justify almost anything. Wisdom, when wedded to power, can become a tool for rationalizing compromise. It can convince itself that small concessions prevent larger conflicts. It can persuade itself that a private practice does not threaten a public identity. It can claim mastery over competing forces, hosting them without being owned by them. That is precisely the pattern later traditions will seize upon when they reshape Solomon into something even more ambiguous. A king who does not merely encounter foreign spiritual powers, but learns to command them. In Jewish and early Christian lore outside the canon, Solomon becomes a figure who stands at the edge of legitimate sacred authority and illicit spiritual control. The Testament of Solomon, for example, presents him as a ruler who compels demons through divine authorization, interrogates them, and uses their knowledge for building projects and protection. Whatever one makes of the text historically, it reflects a memory that had become complicated. Solomon as the one who knows too much, whose wisdom brushes against forces that piety warns against. The canonical portrait is different, but the psychological terrain overlaps. Both portray a man whose reach extends into dangerous territory, whether through alliances, through rituals, or through the belief that wisdom can handle what simpler faith would refuse. And the tradition insists that the cost was not merely personal, it was national. The story does not present Israel as collapsing because Solomon forgot a rule. It presents collapse as the result of a slow moral and religious erosion within the very structures meant to preserve the covenant. The temple stands. The court thrives. The kingdom looks glorious from the outside. But something is shifting under the surface. One of the most haunting elements in the biblical portrayal is the way it frames Solomon's decline as gradual, almost domestic. It is not narrated as one dramatic night of rebellion. It is narrated as a pattern of accommodation over years, an accumulation of marriages, of tolerances, of small legitimizations that eventually reshape the heart. That is how a secret worship can exist in a nation that prides itself on exclusive devotion. Not as an underground cult hidden in fear, but as a tolerated practice hidden in privilege. The Jerusalem of Solomon was not only a city of priests and pilgrims, it was a hub of international culture, a place where foreign craftsmen carved sacred furniture, where imported cedar carried the scent of distant mountains, where treaties were celebrated in banquet halls. And in those halls, under the politeness of empire building, the question of worship could become a matter of diplomacy rather than covenant. The biblical memory refuses to let Solomon's greatness soften that question. It does not deny that he built. It does not deny that he prospered. It does not deny that he prayed and offered sacrifices. It says that the very one who constructed the symbol of Israel's singular devotion also created space, social, political, and perhaps literal, for competing devotions to take root beside it. If that accusation is true in even part, then Solomon's secret worship is not merely a footnote to his reign. It is the key to why later generations could look back at a golden age and see not only glory, but the seed of ruin. Because the most dangerous turning point is not when a nation loses its symbols. It is when a nation keeps them, bright, impressive, and intact, while the loyalties they were built to protect begin to divide quietly in the rooms where power lives. To see why Solomon's private compromises could become a national wound, you have to step into the mental world of his era, where gods were not distant metaphors, but public actors, stitched into law, harvest, fertility, war, and legitimacy. In the Levant, every kingdom had its sacred language of power. A ruler did not simply command armies. He negotiated with the unseen. Victories were credited to patron deities. Famines were interpreted as divine displeasure. A treaty between kings was more than ink on clay or parchment. It was sealed by oaths, witnessed by divine names, guarded by curses meant to strike anyone who broke the pact. Diplomacy and worship were intertwined so tightly that separating them would have seemed not modern, but irrational. That is why marriage alliances mattered so much. A royal bride was not only a wife, she was an embassy that breathed. She carried the prestige of her homeland and the expectations of her dynasty. If she became a queen in Jerusalem, her presence silently asserted that her people were not conquered, only allied. And in that world, honoring her gods could be interpreted as honoring the alliance itself. This is the kind of logic that makes later condemnation feel almost inevitable. Israel's covenant tradition presents devotion as exclusive. The surrounding political world treats devotion as negotiable. Solomon stands at the collision point. The biblical memory does not portray him as a crude idolater who despises Israel's God. It portrays him as a man who knows the language of the covenant, who has built the house, who has offered public worship, who has asked for wisdom. And yet, it also portrays him as a man who gradually begins to live as if worship can be shared, the way borders are shared. The names that appear in the tradition are not random. They are the religious signatures of Israel's neighbors and trading partners, and their mention is freighted with cultural detail. One name evokes the coastal world of Phoenicia, cities that mastered sea trade, purple dye, and luxury craftwork, whose economic gravity pulled inland kingdoms into their orbit. Their goddess was remembered in Israel's texts as a dangerous rival, a figure bound to fertility, royal patronage, and the seduction of foreign splendor. Another name points eastward, toward Moab, where the high plateau held its own national cult, and where war and kingship were tied to the favor of a patron deity. Another name belongs to the Ammonites, a neighboring people whose identity was inseparable from their own sacred traditions. When Israel's narrative speaks of these gods, it speaks of geopolitical entanglement in religious form. This matters because the issue is not simply that Solomon encountered foreign worship. The issue is that he made room for it close to the center. Jerusalem's temple was meant to embody a claim that Israel's God had chosen a place, a name, a covenant people, and a pattern of worship. The temple's rituals were built on boundaries between holy and common, priest and layperson, clean and unclean, permitted and forbidden. It was a system that trained the imagination to think in separations. A royal household, by contrast, trained the imagination to think in accommodations. The palace had to function. It had to keep foreign dignitaries satisfied, keep internal factions balanced, keep trade flowing, keep tribute manageable. In such a setting, a shrine does not present itself as rebellion. It presents itself as pragmatism. A small altar can be framed as courtesy. A ritual can be framed as a private comfort. An imported symbol can be framed as harmless art. That is how a competing devotion can enter a city without a riot. It does not arrive as an army. It arrives as etiquette. And the palace is where etiquette becomes policy. Scholars of ancient religion often point to a reality that can feel uncomfortable for modern readers. Many households, even in cultures that claimed loyalty to a primary deity, practiced a layered spirituality. A public cult might proclaim a national god, while private life made room for protective charms, household rites, local spirits, or revered figures associated with fertility and well-being. In the archaeological record of the broader region, including Israel and Judah, small cult objects appear in domestic settings, suggesting that official theology and lived practice were not always identical. That does not mean the biblical writers invented their concern. It explains why their concern is sharp. Because if common homes could host competing devotions quietly, How much more could a royal court, wealthier, more cosmopolitan, more protected, normalize what the covenant tradition calls betrayal? The ancient category that later writers use as a symbol of this betrayal is the high place. It is a phrase heavy with memory. It conjures hills outside the city, ridge-top shrines, stone altars open to the sky. In some cases, such places may have been used by people who still considered themselves worshippers of Israel's God, long before centralized reforms hardened the expectation that worship should be focused in one sanctuary. In other cases, these sites likely served mixed practices or openly foreign rites. The point is not that every hill shrine was identical. The point is that high places were difficult to supervise. They belonged to local habit, local leadership, local need. Centralization is the opposite of that. Centralization is control. So when the tradition accuses Solomon of building or sponsoring shrines, it is accusing him of doing something deeply symbolic, taking what should have been marginal, scattered, and unofficial, and giving it royal endorsement. That is why the memory places these sites dangerously close to Jerusalem. It is a narrative way of saying that competing worship did not merely exist out there in the countryside. It was allowed to breathe near the center, within the reach of power, under the shadow of the temple. The effect is psychological as much as theological. Because if the king can do it, why not the people? If royal policy can make room for foreign rights, then the covenant's exclusive demand begins to feel negotiable. Once worship becomes negotiable, the covenant stops being a covenant and starts being a heritage, something honored in ceremony, not obeyed in the inner life. The tradition speaks in the language of the heart for a reason. The heart is where negotiation happens. The heart is where a person tells himself that a boundary can bend. The heart is where wisdom can rationalize what devotion would forbid. Solomon's wisdom becomes part of the tragedy. A ruler without insight might stumble into compromise. A ruler with insight can engineer it. He can decide what must remain public and what must remain private. He can construct a world in which the temple's rituals continue with grandeur while other rituals are performed elsewhere, quietly, politely, and with plausible deniability. He can maintain appearances. That is the heart of hidden worship in a royal context. Not secrecy born from fear, but secrecy born from authority. It is the difference between an underground cult and a private chapel. One hides because it is hunted. The other hides because it is protected. The biblical narrative does not need to describe every detail to make its point. It only needs to show the principle, a divided devotion inside the structures of power. And then it ties that division to national fracture. The political brilliance of Solomon's reign is remembered as real. The splendor is not denied, but the tradition also remembers the cost: forced labor, heavy taxation, administrative burdens that fell on the tribes unevenly. A centralized kingdom requires extraction. It requires systems that benefit the capital. It requires compromises that keep international alliances stable. All of that creates pressure. When a nation is under pressure, symbols matter even more. Symbols are what convince people to endure burdens for a larger meaning. The temple was that symbol. So if the temple symbol remained bright, while the covenant loyalty it represented began to blur inside the palace, the nation would carry a contradiction at its center. People would be asked to sacrifice, to labor, to pay, to serve, under the banner of a holy identity that even the king was quietly redefining. It is not difficult to imagine the resentment such a contradiction could breed. Official worship demands loyalty. Daily life reveals hypocrisy. A kingdom cannot sustain that tension indefinitely. This is why later generations told Solomon's story with moral gravity. They were not only condemning a past king, they were diagnosing the pattern that leads to collapse: wealth that breeds dependence, dependence that breeds accommodation, accommodation that breeds divided loyalty, divided loyalty that breeds fragmentation. And once fragmentation begins, it spreads. The biblical memory that follows Solomon's reign is filled with the language of division: tribes splitting, rival sanctuaries, competing claims to legitimacy. Later reformers will look back and insist that the cure is purification. Destroy unauthorized shrines, centralize worship, sever the link between political convenience and ritual compromise. Their reforms will be remembered as national salvation attempts, not merely religious programs. But those reforms will also reveal something sobering. Once the habit of divided worship is rooted, it cannot be erased by decree alone. It lives in homes, in local traditions, in the quiet practices people cling to when they feel uncertain. It lives in the invisible realm where fear, desire, and hope shape devotion more than official liturgy. Solomon, in this memory, becomes the first royal architect of that habit, not because he invented foreign worship in Israel, but because he made it socially safe near the center. He taught the nation, by example, by policy, by the quiet permissions of power, that the covenant's exclusivity could be negotiated without immediate disaster. The tragedy is that immediate disaster is not how national ruin usually arrives. It arrives slowly. It arrives as normalization. It arrives as a generation that grows up thinking compromise is simply the way the world works. And by the time collapse finally comes, the city still looks beautiful. The stones still gleam. The songs still rise. But beneath them, the loyalties that once held the kingdom together have begun to speak different names in the dark. Jerusalem in Solomon's day was not the sprawling stone sea later generations would imagine when they pictured the city of David. It was compact, steep, and intensely strategic, built around ridgelines and narrow valleys, where a few gates could regulate a kingdom's pulse. The sacred center rose on one height, the royal compound clustered close enough to share its prestige, yet separate enough to keep its own secrets. In a place like that, geography itself could become theology. A central sanctuary works only if it can claim the imagination. It must convince people that the holy is not everywhere, that devotion is not a matter of personal preference, and that the God of Israel is not simply another name among the gods of the hills. It demands a rearrangement of instinct. Instead of climbing the nearest ridge to seek help, the worshipper is trained to look toward one place, one altar, one priesthood, one covenant pattern. But ancient instincts do not surrender easily. Across the Levant, hills were sacred long before any king tried to regulate worship. The high ridge was the meeting point between earth and sky, exposed to sun and wind, visible from a distance, easy to mark with stone. A shrine on a height could serve a village for generations without ever needing royal approval. It could also serve as a place where traditions blended, where local customs mixed with imported rites, and where a family's desperation could override a priest's rules. This is where archaeology complicates the neatness of official memory. Material remains from the broader region show that religious life was often domestic and local. Small objects, figurines, amulets, cult stands, miniature altars, appear in ordinary contexts, not only in grand sanctuaries. They imply that people sought protection, fertility, and blessing through practices that did not always align cleanly with a centralized program. Even when a population claimed loyalty to a national god, daily life could still make room for smaller powers, household rites, or symbolic protectors. Religion was not always a single line. It was often a web. If that was true for villages, it could certainly be true for palaces. Solomon's court, filled with foreign tongues and foreign customs, would have been a laboratory for religious accommodation. The palace could host rituals in ways the public sanctuary could not. It could absorb competing devotions into the rhythms of elite life without openly challenging the temple's claim. And once those competing devotions were attached to royal affection and diplomatic stability, they gained a protective shield stronger than any theological argument. That is why the biblical accusation lands so hard on a specific idea. Not that foreign worship existed, but that it was built. To build is to authorize. To build is to allocate labor and material. To build is to inscribe a practice into the landscape, giving it visibility and permanence. A shrine is not a passing gesture. It is a commitment made in stone. When tradition remembers Solomon constructing places for foreign gods, it is saying that compromise was no longer merely tolerated. It was institutionalized. The names associated with this memory are loaded with history. One name points toward the Phoenician coast and its powerful religious culture, woven into trade networks and royal patronage. Another points toward Moab, where national identity and divine allegiance were fused tightly enough that war and worship could feel like the same act. Another points toward Ammon and its own sacred loyalties. These are not imaginary deities invented to decorate a moral story. They represent real religious worlds adjacent to Israel, worlds that Israel traded with, married into, and feared. And yet, the most unsettling dimension of the accusation is not simply which gods are named, but where their worship is placed. Near Jerusalem, near the temple, close enough that the city's skyline could carry two messages at once. That is how a sacred symbol can be hollowed out without being destroyed. The temple can remain bright and authoritative in public. The priesthood can continue its cycles of offerings. Pilgrims can still arrive with vows and gratitude. But nearby, under royal protection, other rites can thrive. Rites that do not announce themselves as rebellion, only as alternative sources of blessing. The covenant tradition insists that this is not neutral. It frames it as spiritual adultery, because devotion is described as relational and exclusive. In that language, the betrayal is intimate. The king is not merely breaking a rule, he is dividing a bond. He is treating the covenant as if it were a treaty that can be renegotiated when politics demands. Later writers, especially those shaped by reform movements, will treat this memory as a crime scene. They will look backward through national trauma and interpret the past with sharpened moral clarity. When a kingdom collapses, when elites are humiliated, when people are displaced, when sacred places are threatened, the question becomes unbearable. Why did this happen? In that kind of crisis, history is not neutral. It becomes a courtroom. Solomon's legacy is pulled into that courtroom. And the evidence is not only the accusation of foreign shrines. The evidence is the pattern of Israel's later kings. How often the tradition says they failed to remove local sanctuaries. How often the high places remained. How often the people mixed worship and called it normal. Solomon becomes the beginning of a long slide. Not because later kings never faced choices of their own, but because the king who built the temple also modeled the possibility of divided loyalty. A reformer's worldview is different from an empire builder's worldview. The empire builder assumes complexity. He assumes that survival requires flexibility. He assumes that stable borders may require spiritual concessions, because politics is never only politics. The reformer assumes that survival requires purity. He assumes that divided worship is not stability, but corrosion. He sees accommodation as the seed of collapse. Those two worldviews collide in Israel's memory. This collision is why the tradition that condemns Solomon is also careful to preserve his brilliance. It does not want a simple villain. It wants a warning. The warning only works if the subject is great. If even a king of wisdom could drift into compromise, then no one should assume they are immune. The question, then, is what Solomon believed he was doing. It is possible to imagine him persuading himself that he had not abandoned Israel's God at all. He could maintain temple worship with public intensity, while treating other rites as political courtesy. He could claim that honoring a foreign queen's traditions was an act of peace, not betrayal. He could tell himself that private space is not the same as national identity. That kind of reasoning is psychologically plausible, and it matches the way power often thinks. Power rarely declares itself corrupt. It declares itself necessary. But covenant language is relentless. It does not measure loyalty by public ceremony alone. It measures loyalty by exclusivity, by refusal, by the willingness to offend political convenience for the sake of a singular devotion. That is why the tradition focuses on the heart. The heart is where a king interprets his own actions. The heart is where he decides whether a shrine is merely a gesture or a surrender. The heart is where he chooses whether wisdom is meant to negotiate boundaries or to guard them. Solomon's story is also a story about religious imagination in a cosmopolitan world. Jerusalem under Solomon was connected. Foreign craftsmen shaped sacred furniture. Foreign materials became the bones of holy architecture. International trade fed the kingdom's luxury. The court learned the manners of the wider Near East. In such a setting, a strict exclusivity could begin to feel parochial, an obstacle to diplomacy, a source of unnecessary offense. And once exclusivity starts to feel like an obstacle, compromise begins to feel like maturity. That is the seduction of empire building. The belief that you can host many worlds without being changed by them. Yet the biblical memory insists that hosting is never neutral. To host is to be shaped. Ritual is not merely expression, it is formation. The repeated gesture changes the one who performs it. The repeated tolerance changes the community that witnesses it. The repeated presence of competing rights near the center changes what the center means. This is why later traditions about Solomon drift into darker territory. Outside the canonical narrative, Solomon becomes a figure associated with hidden knowledge and spiritual authority that feels perilously close to forbidden power. Stories circulate about him, commanding spirits, forcing them to reveal secrets, binding them to labor, using sacred names as instruments. Whatever one concludes about the historical value of those texts, they reveal something important about cultural memory. Solomon's wisdom was not remembered as harmless. It was remembered as a force that could cross boundaries. Even within the canonical framework, that boundary crossing is present, though described differently. It appears in the blending of diplomacy and devotion. It appears in the transformation of private courtesy into public precedent. It appears in the way the king's household becomes a place where Israel's exclusive covenant claim must live alongside competing loyalties. The tension, once established, does not stay confined to one reign. A society absorbs the habits of its elite. When the palace normalizes religious accommodation, the countryside receives permission without ever receiving an official announcement. People do what they have always done. They seek help where they believe help can be found. They bring offerings to places that feel close. They honor traditions passed down through family lines. They add rather than replace, because adding feels safer than choosing. And over time, The covenant's exclusivity can be reduced to a banner, still displayed, still celebrated, still sung, while the lived reality becomes layered and divided. Solomon's brilliance cannot prevent that drift. In a sense, it enables it. His success gives credibility to his choices. As long as the kingdom prospers, compromise can claim it has produced peace. As long as the city shines, the quiet shrines can be treated as harmless. But the tradition that preserves this story is not satisfied with surface prosperity. It looks for deeper integrity. It treats worship as the core of identity, not as a private preference. It insists that a nation can lose itself without losing its buildings. So Solomon's hidden worship, as Israel remembers it, is not a sensational secret revealed in a single scandal. It is a slow transformation protected by power and justified by wisdom. It is the creation of sacred alternatives near the sacred center. It is the quiet act of turning devotion into policy. The temple still stands on its height, claiming singular loyalty. And yet, nearby, other names begin to share the air of Jerusalem. If you walked the roads around Jerusalem in Solomon's era, you would not have found a clear line where Israelite worship ended and everything else began. You would have found gradients. A traveler approaching the city would see the temple height and feel the pull of a central claim. One God, one house, one altar authorized to carry the nation's offerings in a concentrated, regulated way. That claim was powerful precisely because it was rare. Across the ancient Near East, religion was usually scattered. Many shrines, many local sanctuaries, many sacred hills. Centralization was not the default. It was a political and theological project. Yet beyond the temple precinct, the landscape kept its older habits. People built meaning into the places that had always held meaning. A ridge where an ancestor prayed, a spring where flocks gathered, a grove where vows were whispered, a border shrine where travelers sought protection. Even when a national cult attempted to gather worship into a single center, everyday life still reached for the sacred nearby. Fear and longing do not wait for official permission. This is where the category of high places becomes more than a phrase. A high place was not necessarily a grand temple. It could be modest, stones arranged for offerings, a standing pillar, a small platform where incense burned, a sheltered niche where a symbol was kept. Some sites may have been used for devotion to Israel's God outside the centralized sanctuary, especially in earlier phases of Israelite religion. Others likely hosted blended rites, local traditions mixed with borrowed practices, a sacred vocabulary shared across neighboring peoples. The reality is not clean, and the biblical writers know that. Their language of condemnation is not aimed at a single isolated shrine. It is aimed at a pattern. Worship that escapes covenant boundaries because it is dispersed, convenient, and rooted in local life. Solomon's palace could turn that pattern from scattered habit into sanctioned culture. The difference between a village shrine and a royal shrine is not only size, it is status. A village altar can be dismissed as ignorance. A royal altar becomes precedent. It tells the nation what can be treated as acceptable. It teaches the elites what can be normalized. It signals to priests, officials, and merchants that the king's household is not bound by the same constraints it publicly praises. That is why the tradition's accusation about Solomon feels almost surgical. It does not merely say he failed to stop foreign worship. It describes him as establishing it close to the city, near enough to brush against the temple's authority without openly challenging it. That kind of placement is psychologically brilliant in the darkest way. Too far from Jerusalem, a foreign shrine would be easy to condemn as a provincial corruption. Too close, inside the temple precinct itself, it would provoke a crisis. But placed near the center while still outside the official boundary, it becomes ambiguous. Ambiguity is where compromise thrives. A practice can be defended as private, diplomatic, or cultural rather than theological. It can be framed as respect for allies rather than betrayal of covenant. It can exist in the space where power is most comfortable, the space where ordinary scrutiny is limited. The ancient world had many such spaces: palace terraces, private courtyards, gardens enclosed by walls, elevated platforms with controlled entry. These were not merely architectural luxuries. They were mechanisms of privacy. In societies where public ritual was central to identity, private ritual could still occur, but it needed protection. The palace provided that protection by design. The king's domestic life was not open to the tribes the way the temple's life was. It was guarded, managed, curated. This is one reason the biblical critique of Solomon chooses the language of intimacy. It frames foreign worship as something bound to love, to marital bonds, to the quiet influence of the household. That is not only moral rhetoric, it is an accurate description of how religion travels. Religion does not always move through conquest and proclamation. It often moves through family, through affection, through daily routine. A queen who keeps her homeland's rituals does not necessarily do so as an act of rebellion. She does so because ritual is memory. It is home. It is the way a person handles fear, childbirth, illness, loneliness in a foreign land. A king who accommodates those rituals can tell himself he is being humane. But the covenant tradition does not measure devotion by empathy alone. It measures devotion by exclusivity. It insists that compassion cannot become an excuse for divided allegiance. This conflict between empathy and exclusivity is the human heart of the Solomon story. It is also where archaeology and cultural history quietly add weight. The physical remnants of ancient religion suggest that many people in Israel and Judah lived with layered devotional practices. Household figurines found in domestic contexts hint at concerns that official worship did not fully cover in the popular imagination. Fertility, protection, the well-being of children, safety in childbirth, the everyday fragility that makes humans seek tangible assurance. Incense altars and small cult stands indicate ritual habits that could be performed privately, without priests, without pilgrimage. Inscriptions from the broader region show the way divine names could be invoked in familiar, domestic language, not only in formal sanctuary speech. None of this proves a single story detail about Solomon's personal practice, but it illuminates the environment. It shows how plausible it is that a royal household could host multiple devotions while still presenting itself publicly as the guardian of the temple. When the tradition condemns Solomon, it is condemning something more subtle than open apostasy. It is condemning the creation of a two-tier religious life, one form of worship for public identity, another for private convenience. The temple becomes the stage where the nation's official devotion is performed. The palace becomes the place where competing devotions are managed as if they were harmless. The danger of such a system is that it teaches the kingdom to live with contradiction. A contradiction can be survived for a time, especially when prosperity masks its cost. Solomon's era is remembered as wealthy, stable, internationally connected. In such conditions, many people are willing to interpret religious compromise as wisdom. Peace seems like proof. Luxury seems like blessing. Success becomes the argument. Yet the biblical memory refuses to let success settle the question. It treats covenant loyalty as the criterion by which kings are judged, not economic achievement. That standard becomes sharper in the hands of prophetic critique. The prophets, in Israel's tradition, are not polite commentators. They are covenant prosecutors. They speak as if the nation is in court, as if the crime is not merely personal wrongdoing, but a breach of identity that will corrode everything else. Their worldview assumes a link that modern readers often resist, a connection between worship and justice, devotion and social order, the sacred center and the way power treats ordinary people. From that perspective, Solomon's hidden worship is not an isolated spiritual error. It is a symptom of a deeper drift in kingship itself. A king who can bend covenant boundaries in private can also bend social boundaries in public. A king who believes he can domesticate foreign powers can also domesticate his own people, turning them into instruments for building projects. A king who treats worship as negotiable can also treat labor and land as negotiable. The tradition that remembers heavy burdens under Solomon's statecraft is not separate from the tradition that remembers religious compromise. Both are expressions of the same phenomenon: centralized power that believes it can manage everything, faith, economy, alliances, human lives, by calculation. A temple can rise under that kind of power. So can resentment. Later generations will remember Solomon's building program as dazzling, but they will also remember the price. Centralization concentrates glory. It also concentrates extraction. The capital becomes magnificent, while the countryside feels the weight. When people begin to feel that weight, they ask whether the sacred symbol at the center truly represents a shared covenant or merely the ideology of the elite. If, at the same time, the elite are seen to practice a different kind of devotion in private, the moral bond between ruler and people weakens. This helps explain why later reform movements become so intense. When kings in later centuries attempt to remove unauthorized shrines and purge competing devotions, they do not present their actions as mere policy. They present them as rescue operations, as a return to covenant integrity, as a cleansing of the land. They treat dispersed worship as a threat not only to theology, but to national survival. The fact that such reforms were necessary suggests that the patterns they fought were deeply rooted and socially normal. A practice deeply rooted is rarely born from one moment. It grows. Solomon's story is remembered as a seedbed because it merges three forces that make growth inevitable: royal authority, international entanglement, and the privacy of the palace. Once those forces align, what begins as accommodation can become tradition. What begins as a private concession can become a public permission. What begins as one shrine for one alliance can become a network of tolerated devotions that shape a generation's instincts. This is also why the tradition's language sometimes becomes severe when speaking of certain rites. Some foreign cults in the region were associated, at least in polemical memory, with practices Israel's covenant tradition found intolerable. The texts speak of offerings that cross a moral line, describing acts that later writers treat as the darkest form of betrayal. Scholars debate the historical details of such accusations, and polemic can amplify reality. But even the presence of the accusation tells you what is at stake in Israel's self-understanding. Worship is not only about names and symbols, it is about the moral boundaries a community believes the divine has set. So when Solomon is remembered as making room for foreign worship, the charge is not merely that he offended tradition. The charge is that he opened the kingdom to a different moral universe. And that, in covenant logic, is how a nation begins to unravel. Not because the temple collapses overnight, not because lightning strikes the palace, but because the center loses integrity while retaining splendor. The people continue to sing the old songs, But the elite begin to live by a newer, quieter theology. That devotion can be managed, divided, balanced, negotiated. A covenant community cannot stay coherent under that theology. Over time, the question stops being whether the king is loyal. It becomes whether loyalty is even expected in the way it once was. Once expectations change, a nation can keep its sacred architecture while losing its sacred identity. Solomon's hidden worship is remembered as the moment that possibility becomes real. A temple on one height, proclaiming singular devotion, and near it, protected by the dignity of power, the beginnings of a second sacred map, one that teaches Israel to live with divided names. Power has a way of turning private life into public theology. In a small kingdom, the habits of a king do not stay personal for long. A shepherd can disappear into a hillside and pray without consequence. A monarch cannot. Every gesture becomes precedent. Every tolerance becomes permission. Every silence becomes instruction. Solomon's reign, remembered as an age of order, depended on a delicate balance. Jerusalem had to look like the center of the world without actually being the center of the world. The kingdom was wealthy, but its wealth was not self-generated in isolation. It moved through ports, caravans, treaty roads, and merchant networks. Cedar from the north, artisans from coastal cities, horses from distant markets, luxury goods carried by hands that also carried stories. And with those stories came gods, not always as loud declarations, often as quiet assumptions. In the ancient Near East, a deity was not only worshipped, a deity was represented. A symbol was enough to make presence feel real. A carved figure, a small standing stone, an incense burner with familiar motifs, a ritual vessel used in a remembered sequence. These were not decorations. They were a language. They told the body how to act, told the mind what to fear, told a household where to place its hopes when the night felt dangerous. A royal household could accumulate that language without ever announcing that it had changed religions. A queen's attendants might keep their ancestral rituals as acts of continuity. A foreign priest might be treated as a specialist, someone who knows how to avert disaster, ensure fertility, bless childbirth, secure the favor of forces that feel real to those who grew up beneath their names. A king might allow this because allowance feels like strength. In a court, refusing can look like weakness. Permitting can look like magnanimity. That is how a kingdom can be reshaped, while insisting it has not moved. The biblical memory of Solomon's compromise is framed through a specific kind of storytelling, moral history. It is not content to list events. It interprets them. It asks what kind of heart lies behind an action, and it treats the heart as the hidden engine of national fate. In that tradition, Solomon is not condemned for building a palace or forming alliances. He is condemned because the covenant is presented as a bond that cannot be shared, the way political obligations can be shared. This is where the story becomes less about architecture and more about identity. A central sanctuary claims to unify a people under one sacred narrative. The temple is not only a place of offerings, it is the visible declaration that the nation belongs to one divine name, that the center is sacred, that the king himself serves something higher than his own calculation. In that sense, the temple is meant to discipline kingship. It is meant to remind the ruler that power has limits. But Solomon's palace, its wealth, privacy, and international reach, could undo that discipline from within. The tradition's accusation that he established places for foreign worship is, at its core, an accusation about what the king chose to make normal. It suggests that the sacred geography around Jerusalem began to host competing centers of meaning. A temple that demands exclusivity can survive scattered local shrines for a time, especially if those shrines are treated as remnants of older habits. What it cannot survive is the emergence of alternative sacred sites that draw legitimacy from royal consent. Royal consent changes everything, because consent does not simply permit worship, it dignifies it. It grants it cultural safety. It makes it possible for elites to practice without shame, for officials to participate without fear, for the court to treat multiple devotions as refined sophistication rather than covenant betrayal. Once elite practice shifts, the people do not need a proclamation. They notice what is rewarded. They see what is tolerated. They interpret silence as permission. In this way, religious compromise does not spread like propaganda. It spreads like etiquette. And etiquette is powerful because it does not feel like rebellion. It feels like manners. The biblical tradition, especially in the strands shaped by later reform movements, interprets the persistence of local shrines and mixed practices as a disease that must be cut out. It remembers kings who attempted purges, destroying unauthorized sites, removing local cult objects, insisting that worship be gathered and regulated. Those efforts are narrated as moral victories, not because centralization is treated as politically convenient, but because it is portrayed as covenant restoration. That later memory also reveals something uncomfortable. Whatever reforms were attempted, the habits they targeted had become deeply normal. Deeply normal habits usually have deep roots. This is why Solomon matters so much in the storyline. His reign is remembered as the moment when the most powerful man in Israel modeled a new relationship between covenant and convenience. If the king could divide devotion while still presiding over a shining temple, then the boundary between loyalty and pragmatism became negotiable. Negotiability is intoxicating to power. It allows a king to manage rival interests without choosing sides decisively. It allows him to keep alliances warm. It allows him to keep households peaceful. It allows him to appear stable while accommodating forces that could otherwise threaten stability. But covenant logic treats negotiability as corrosion, because negotiability turns the sacred into a tool. A tool can be used, adjusted, put away. A covenant cannot. A covenant is a claim that binds the self even when binding is costly. When Solomon is accused of letting love reshape worship, the narrative is not only describing romance or desire, it is describing the way private loyalties can quietly rewrite public obligations. A marriage alliance does not only bring affection, it brings obligations that feel personal. A queen is not an abstract treaty. She is a human being with needs, fears, and customs. The king who satisfies those needs may tell himself he is being humane. The covenant tradition asks whether his humanity became a door through which a rival sacred world entered the center. That question becomes sharper when the story is placed against the wider ancient context. Many Near Eastern kings acted as patrons of multiple cults. A ruler could honor a national deity while also supporting regional sanctuaries and allied gods, treating religious plurality as a sign of broad sovereignty. In that worldview, hosting many divine names is a form of political competence. It signals that the king is secure enough to contain complexity. Israel's covenant tradition rejects that worldview at the level of principle. It insists that the nation's identity is not built on the king's flexibility, but on the people's exclusive allegiance. It insists that the king is not above that allegiance. It insists that the temple is not a stage for prestige, but a center of truth. This clash between two political theologies is why Solomon becomes such a contested figure. He embodies the empire builder's instincts in a covenant society. He centralizes administration. He expands wealth. He draws international attention. He builds. He organizes. He creates a capital that looks like a regional power. Yet the same machinery that produces splendor also produces distance. The capital becomes its own world. The court becomes its own culture. And once the court becomes a culture distinct from the people, it becomes easier for the court to justify devotions the people would find strange. It becomes easier for the court to live with two truths at once. Publicly, the temple is the heart of the nation. Privately, the palace will do what it must to keep the nation functioning. The biblical memory condemns the private truth, not because it denies the need for diplomacy, but because it denies that diplomacy can redefine covenant. There is also another layer in how Solomon is remembered, one that later traditions amplify into a darker portrait. Outside the canon, stories arise that depict Solomon as a man who handles spiritual forces as if they were instruments, binding, commanding, compelling hidden beings through sacred names. Those stories are not written like simple fantasies. They are written like explanations for how a king could build wonders and manage dangers. They reflect a cultural intuition. Solomon's wisdom was not only intellectual, it felt like access to knowledge, access to power, access to the unseen. Even if those later portrayals are read as theological imagination rather than history, they resonate with the canonical anxiety. The anxiety is that wisdom, when paired with authority, can persuade itself it has mastery over boundaries that should not be crossed. It can persuade itself it can host what it should refuse. Host enough, and the host changes. This is why the narrative's language remains stubbornly interior. It returns again and again to loyalty, an inner posture that cannot be measured only by public ceremony. A king can offer sacrifices and still divide his devotion. A city can sing hymns and still normalize rival names in protected spaces. A temple can gleam and still stand beside an altered sacred map. Altered sacred maps have consequences, not always immediate, not dramatic, often slow. A nation begins to interpret its own identity differently. People begin to think of worship as additive rather than exclusive. They begin to measure divine favor by prosperity rather than by covenant integrity. They begin to treat sacred commitments like alliances, valuable but negotiable when the stakes feel high. Over time, that shift changes what a people fears. Instead of fearing covenant breach, they fear political instability more. Instead of fearing divided devotion, they fear offending allies. Instead of trusting one divine name as sufficient, they begin to feel safer with options. Options feel wise until crisis arrives. Because in a crisis, divided loyalties do not hold together. A kingdom can survive with a strong center and a shared sacred story. When the center loses integrity, when it becomes a symbol detached from the inner life of power, the shared story weakens. People sense it. Even if they cannot name it in theological language, they recognize the gap between what is proclaimed and what is practiced. That gap breeds cynicism. Cynicism breeds fracture. And fracture rarely begins with an enemy at the gate. It begins with a quiet loss of coherence inside the walls. Solomon's secret worship, as the tradition remembers it, is the moment that quiet loss becomes possible while everything still looks magnificent. The temple stands as a national heart, but the palace begins to beat to additional rhythms. The city remains holy in its public speech, yet power has learned to treat holiness as one instrument among many. A kingdom can build wonders that way. It can also build the conditions of its own unraveling. When Solomon died, the brilliance did not vanish in a single night. The buildings were still there. the administrative machine still functioned. The trade routes still carried goods across the hills. The temple still stood, newly old, its stones not yet softened by centuries, its rituals still young enough to feel like the future. And yet the kingdom's unity was already brittle. The biblical tradition remembers the fracture as political, but it refuses to separate politics from worship. The split is described as the tearing of a fabric that had been stretched too far. Heavy burdens, resentment in the tribes, a court culture that had become distant from the countryside. These are historical pressures any scholar of ancient states would recognize. Centralization creates splendor at the center and strain at the edges. Tribute systems enrich capitals and exhaust villages. A king can hold it together for a time, especially if prosperity masks the cost. But once the king is gone, what was held together by his authority begins to reveal its seams. The memory of Solomon's hidden worship lives inside that moment of unraveling as a moral explanation for why seams were already there. In the tradition, divided devotion is not an isolated sin. It is the spiritual equivalent of political overreach, a form of internal fragmentation that mirrors the social fragmentation produced by extraction and privilege. This is why later generations tell the story the way they do. They were not writing a neutral biography. They were producing an interpretation of national collapse. The writers who shaped Israel's royal narratives did so in the shadow of catastrophe, shaped by loss, reform, exile, and the haunting question of how a people chosen by a covenant could end up scattered and dominated. Their answer is consistent. The covenant was not merely neglected, it was compromised at the center. Solomon becomes the emblem of that center. In their telling, he is judged by a standard that does not care whether he expanded trade or dazzled foreign envoys. The standard is loyalty, exclusive devotion expressed not only by ritual, but by refusal. The king is measured by whether he protected the covenant boundaries when the world pressured him to soften them. From that perspective, the most dangerous element of Solomon's reign is not that he encountered foreign cults, it is that he integrated them into the social life of power. He modeled a kingship that could perform devotion publicly while managing alternate sacred obligations privately. He made the palace a place where worship could be negotiated. Negotiation, in this worldview, is the first step toward replacement. After the kingdom fractures, the tradition's attention turns again and again to shrines outside the central sanctuary. New royal centers arise. Alternate sanctuaries are established. Local sites become politically useful. Once the unity of Jerusalem's claim is contested by rival kings, worship becomes even more entangled with legitimacy. A sanctuary is not only where people pray, it is where a regime teaches people who they are. This is where the older problem of high places becomes unavoidable. If centralization was always incomplete, division makes it even harder. Competing capitals need competing sacred centers. Local shrines become political tools. The covenant tradition, which demanded one center and one exclusive loyalty, now faces a landscape where power itself is divided. And in that divided landscape, the temptation to treat worship as flexible becomes normal. This is the world in which reform movements emerge as moral revolts. At certain points in Judah's later history, kings attempt to purge unauthorized shrines, remove local cult objects, and reassert the exclusive claim of Jerusalem. These reforms are remembered with unusual intensity, suggesting not only political will but a passionate anxiety. The fear that the nation's identity is dissolving into the religious habits of the surrounding world. The reformers speak as if Israel is living on borrowed time, as if the land itself can no longer bear divided devotion. Whether every detail of those reform narratives reflects immediate historical reality or later idealization, the intensity reveals the stakes. A people whose sacred story has been threatened by empire does not treat worship as a private matter. It treats worship as survival. This is also where the story moves from the surface of kingship into the quieter evidence that archaeology and ancient texts provide. For a long time, it was easy to imagine ancient Israelite religion as sharply distinct from the religions around it. One God, one temple, clear boundaries. Yet material culture has often suggested a more complex, lived reality. Household religion appears pervasive. Small figurines, incense altars, cult stands, and protective symbols found in domestic contexts. These artifacts do not speak in theological propositions. They speak in human needs: fear of sickness, longing for fertility, anxiety about childbirth, hope for protection in a dangerous world. Inscriptions from later centuries add another layer of complexity. Some mention blessings spoken in the name of Israel's God, alongside language that has fueled scholarly debate about associated sacred figures or symbols. These short texts are not systematic theology, and they are not written for modern scrutiny. They are glimpses into how ordinary people invoked the divine, how they imagined protection, how religious language functioned in daily life far from royal courts. Scholars disagree on how to interpret such evidence. Some argue that certain phrases reflect the lingering presence of a divine consort tradition inherited from broader Canaanite religion, a sign that popular practice included elements that official theology condemned. Others argue that the language may refer to sacred objects or cultic symbols rather than a separate goddess, pointing to the way religious imagery can persist even when theology shifts. Still others emphasize that ancient religion is rarely uniform. It is often layered, contested, and shaped by region, class, and historical crisis. What is clear is that the religion of Israel, as lived by many people over centuries, was not always as tidy as the covenant ideal. This does not render the biblical condemnation meaningless. It makes it more intelligible. A society does not produce fierce reform rhetoric unless the problem is real enough to threaten identity. A tradition does not repeatedly condemn high places unless high places were socially normal. A narrative does not turn Solomon into the origin of a long spiritual decline unless later generations saw in his story the pattern they were trying to break. In this light, Solomon's secret worship becomes less a sensational hidden ritual and more a symbol for something broader: the domestication of religious plurality at the center of power. And that symbol matters because power teaches habit. In every society, the elite model what can be done without consequence. When the elite treat devotion as flexible, the people learn flexibility. When the elite treat sacred boundaries as negotiable, the people learn negotiation. In a covenant society, that learning process is treated as a betrayal not because it is exotic, but because it is effective. It changes what the next generation assumes is normal. The canonical portrait of Solomon is careful to make the betrayal feel intimate rather than abstract. It ties compromise to love, to the household, to the slow influence of daily proximity. This is psychologically plausible. People rarely abandon deepest loyalties because they wake up craving rebellion. They drift because affection reorders priorities, because convenience dulls resistance, because what was once unthinkable becomes familiar. The drift is gradual. That is its power. The later, darker lore about Solomon, stories of hidden knowledge, spiritual command, the manipulation of unseen beings, fits into this same psychological territory, even when its details move beyond history. It reflects a cultural suspicion that Solomon's wisdom, unmatched and praised, also brought him near dangerous borders. Wisdom can be a shield. It can also become arrogance. It can whisper that boundaries exist for ordinary people, not for kings. That whisper is the root of many kinds of collapse. A king who believes he can manage competing sacred forces may also believe he can manage the people who serve him without moral consequence. A ruler who treats devotion as an instrument may also treat justice as an instrument. The covenant tradition repeatedly links idolatry with oppression, not because it assumes every foreign ritual directly causes cruelty, but because it sees divided devotion as the spiritual face of divided ethics. If loyalty to the divine can be negotiated, then loyalty to the vulnerable can be negotiated too. This is where the biblical story becomes a diagnosis of power rather than merely a critique of foreign religion. Solomon is remembered as the one who built the greatest sacred symbol of Israel, while simultaneously demonstrating how a sacred symbol can be maintained as spectacle even when the inner allegiance it represents begins to fray. The temple can remain brilliant while the palace becomes spiritually plural. The rituals can remain public while private compromises reshape what power truly trusts. In that scenario, the question is no longer whether the nation still has a temple. The question is what the temple means. If it becomes a monument to national pride rather than a boundary that disciplines kingship, it can stand for decades while losing its moral force. People can still gather, still offer, still sing, still celebrate festivals, and yet increasingly seek security through other names, other rites, other habits that feel more immediately responsive to fear. That is not how a nation loses its identity with noise. It is how a nation loses its identity with normality. The memory of Solomon's hidden worship endures because it captures that quiet process in one figure. It is not simply a story about an ancient king's private sins. It is a story about how devotion can be divided in the very place where unity is supposed to be guarded, and how that division can persist under the cover of prosperity until the day prosperity fails to hold the structure together. When the structure finally cracks, the stones are still impressive, but the loyalties beneath them are no longer one. Long after Solomon's bones turned to dust, his name kept moving through the ancient world like a sealed letter passed hand to hand. It moved through hymns and warnings, through court tales and village proverbs, through scribal debates and whispered stories about what a wise king could see when other men saw only stone and shadow. That afterlife matters, because it reveals something the surface narrative cannot. Solomon became a mirror. Each later generation looked into him and saw its own fear. Some saw the builder of a sanctuary that promised divine nearness. Some saw the monarch who proved Israel could stand among the great kingdoms. Others, especially those living under ruin, exile, and foreign dominion, saw something sharper. The king who demonstrated how sacred symbols can remain dazzling while the inner loyalty they represent begins to fracture. That is why the memory of his hidden worship did not fade. It was too useful as a diagnosis, not because it was convenient propaganda, but because it captured a pattern people recognized in their own world. The private compromises of power often outlive the public triumphs. In Judah's later centuries, when reformers tried to pull the nation back toward an exclusive devotion, they did so in a landscape already thick with competing sacred habits. The land held shrines that had stood through many reigns. Families had their own rituals. Local sanctuaries had their own reputations. Even the vocabulary of worship could shift from region to region. Reform was never simply a matter of issuing decrees. It was a struggle over memory and instinct. The old covenant ideal insisted on one center, one loyalty, one sacred boundary that disciplined every appetite. political and personal. The lived reality kept producing alternatives, altars that promised quick help, rites that felt closer to the anxieties of ordinary life, symbols that could be held in the hand. When reformers rose, kings and prophets, scribes and priests aligned in purpose, they interpreted this landscape as spiritual emergency. They spoke as if the land itself had been polluted by divided devotion, as if the nation's survival depended on tearing down the altars that stood outside covenant boundaries. In that context, Solomon's story became a foundational warning. The logic was blunt. If the greatest king opened the door, then lesser kings merely walked through it. If the door was opened near the center, then the whole land learned to treat covenant loyalty as negotiable. But reform also sharpened another tension. The more a community insists on purity, the more it must explain impurity. It must locate the origin of the drift. It must identify the moment when compromise became normal enough to survive in public life. Solomon was the perfect origin point, glorious enough to be unforgettable, complex enough to be plausible, and central enough that his choices could be blamed for everything that followed. This is where the canonical memory begins to overlap with a different stream of tradition, the Solomon of hidden knowledge. In later Jewish and early Christian writings beyond the biblical canon, Solomon's wisdom does not remain a matter of governance and poetry alone. It becomes access. It becomes mastery over forces that ordinary worshippers fear. It becomes the ability to name what is unseen and compel it to serve. One of the most famous examples is a late antique work known as the Testament of Solomon. It is not scripture, and it was written in a world very different from Solomon's Iron Age Jerusalem. Yet its influence reveals how Solomon was imagined by people who lived under empires, surrounded by spiritual anxieties, in cultures where illness, infertility, and sudden death could feel like assaults from invisible powers. In that text, Solomon is portrayed as receiving divine authorization, often framed through sacred names, signs, and a powerful seal, allowing him to command demons, interrogate them, and force them into labor for building projects. Each spirit has a name, a domain, a method of harm, and sometimes a countermeasure. It reads like a catalog of fear given structure, the chaos of suffering organized into a taxonomy. The king becomes the one who can impose order on that chaos, not only through law and architecture, but through spiritual control. This portrait can be misunderstood if it is treated as a simple fantasy. It functions like a cultural document. It tells you what late antique communities feared and how they tried to interpret that fear. It also tells you why Solomon's reputation for wisdom could become dangerous. In a world where survival felt fragile, wisdom was not just insight, it was protection. And a king remembered as uniquely wise could be reimagined as uniquely armed against the unseen. Yet there is an irony that haunts this tradition. The same Solomon who is remembered in biblical memory as compromising with foreign worship becomes, in later lore, the one who defeats foreign and hostile spirits. The builder of alternative shrines becomes the master who binds what should not be welcomed. The king who made room for competing sacred names becomes the king who weaponizes sacred naming itself. That contradiction is not an accident. It is the shape of cultural struggle. Communities that felt threatened by religious plurality did not only condemn it, they also tried to dominate it. They sought ways to survive in a world filled with rival powers, political and spiritual, without surrendering their identity. In that struggle, Solomon's name became a banner for both impulses, warning and control. Early Jewish interpretive traditions also show how elastic Solomon's image could become. Midrashic material often treats him as a wise judge, a ruler whose insight penetrates deception. At times he appears as a figure whose greatness is affirmed yet bounded, a king who can be criticized precisely because his gifts were so extraordinary. In some strands, his encounter with foreign influences becomes a moral lesson about desire and overreach. In others, his wisdom is highlighted as a divine gift that should have guarded him against precisely the drift he later embodied. The same tension appears in the way later interpreters handled the temple itself. The temple was not only a building, it was the anchor of identity. When it was threatened, destroyed, or rebuilt, the meaning of Solomon's legacy became even heavier. To rebuild was to declare continuity. To remember Solomon was to remember a time when the sacred center was secure. But to remember Solomon's compromises was to remember that security can be undermined from within. The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal a community that lived with this tension in an intense form. Many of the scrolls are not about Solomon directly, but their worldview is shaped by the conviction that the temple establishment of their day was corrupted, that proper worship had been compromised, and that a purified community had to live in separation until divine intervention set things right. They speak like people who believe the center has been contaminated by hidden compromises. Their language is filled with boundaries between light and darkness, truth and deceit, the faithful and the polluted. Even without naming Solomon, that worldview reflects the same anxiety Solomon's story embodies, the fear that official worship can continue while integrity collapses. Targumic and other interpretive traditions, translating and expanding biblical narratives for later audiences, often sharpen moral dimensions and clarify ambiguities. In such interpretive settings, stories are not only preserved, they are made legible for new crises. A king's compromise becomes a lesson for communities living under foreign rulers. The dangers of mixed worship become warnings for people navigating plural religious landscapes. The memory of a divided heart becomes a model for understanding how an empire can occupy a land without fully conquering the inner life. Because compromise can accomplish what conquest cannot. Archaeology, too, presses the question from another angle. The physical evidence from the region suggests that religious life in Israel and Judah was frequently more textured than a single, centralized ideal. Household practices, local shrines, and the persistence of ritual objects in domestic contexts indicate that many people sought divine help through forms that did not always align with official programs. This does not cancel the biblical vision. It reveals why that vision had to be fought for repeatedly. A strict exclusivity in a world where every neighboring people had their own gods and where daily fear demanded immediate comfort was not a natural default. It was a covenant project. And covenant projects leave behind polemics. When later biblical writers evaluate kings, they do so with the vocabulary of loyalty and boundaries. Their histories do not read like neutral chronicles. They read like moral interpretation shaped by covenant logic. Blessing linked to obedience. Fracture linked to compromise. This style of history, forged in the aftermath of national trauma, does not simply report. It teaches. It compresses centuries into patterns meant to warn. Solomon's story becomes the most haunting pattern because it is not the story of a king who failed publicly and instantly. It is the story of a king who succeeded publicly while failing privately. It is the story of a temple that can gleam even while competing devotions are granted space nearby. It is the story of wisdom that can build wonders while justifying small accommodations that later become national habits. That is why Solomon's name could carry two opposite kinds of memory at once: the king of divine wisdom and the king of divided devotion, the builder of the sacred center and the one who allowed rival sacred claims to breathe in the same air. To later generations, the question was not only what Solomon did. The question was what his reign proved about human nature. It proved that intelligence does not guarantee faithfulness. It proved that splendor can coexist with compromise. It proved that power can keep a nation's rituals functioning while quietly reshaping what power truly trusts. And once power learns that skill, it does not need to destroy the temple. It only needs to keep it shining. A story like Solomon's cannot remain only a story about one man because it touches the nerve of how an entire culture learns to remember itself. The more Israel's later generations suffered loss, first political weakness, then foreign domination, then the humiliation of seeing sacred places threatened, the more the past became a moral landscape. Memory hardened into categories: faithfulness and betrayal, purity and mixture, covenant and compromise. In that landscape, Solomon's hidden worship became more than a private scandal. It became a template for explaining how a people can drift without noticing the moment it happens. The drift is the key. Open rebellion is easy to name. It sets itself apart. It provokes a response. But drift occurs inside normal life. Drift happens while songs continue, while festivals remain, while the temple courts still echo with the footsteps of pilgrims. Drift does not require a king to renounce the God of Israel with a public declaration. It requires only that the king learns to treat devotion the way he treats alliances, as something that can be expanded, managed, balanced, adjusted to circumstance. A central sanctuary was designed to resist that kind of thinking. It trained the nation toward one center and one sacred language. It gathered worship into a pattern that could be taught, supervised, corrected. It created a moral geography. There is an inside and an outside, a holy and a common, a loyalty and a rival. It was meant to simplify the nation's imagination, not in an intellectual sense, but in a covenant sense. One people, one God, one bond that cannot be divided. Solomon's court pulled in the opposite direction. A court thrives on complexity. It negotiates across borders. It absorbs foreign influences as proof of sophistication. It treats difference as an asset, something to be leveraged rather than feared. In the ancient Near East, kings often signaled strength by showing that they could host multiple sacred loyalties without panic. A ruler who could honor many gods, or at least acknowledge them, could appear cosmopolitan and secure. It was a political language as much as a religious one. Israel's covenant tradition treated that language as poison, not because it denied the existence of other peoples or other religious worlds, but because it framed Israel's identity as a refusal. The covenant is remembered as a love that does not share. The divine name is described as jealous, not in petty insecurity, but in the sense that exclusive devotion is the foundation of the relationship. If that foundation cracks, everything built upon it becomes unstable. Justice, kingship, communal coherence, the moral logic that binds tribes into one story. This is why later writers seem almost obsessed with the question of unauthorized worship sites, local shrines, and blended rituals. They are not only policing theology, they are trying to preserve a nation's internal architecture. The most revealing element in the tradition is that it does not insist the temple vanished during Solomon's compromise. It insists the temple continued. That detail is frightening on purpose. It means a society can preserve its most sacred institution while losing the exclusivity the institution is meant to guard. It means a king can speak the language of devotion and still cultivate rival practices in protected spaces. It means the center can remain brilliant while the heart becomes divided. This is where the accusation about Solomon's heart carries its full weight. The heart, in Israel's thought, is not merely emotion. It is the inner compass. It is what a person truly trusts when the public role is stripped away. A king may perform public worship because it stabilizes the realm, unifies the people, and legitimizes rule. But the heart is revealed by what he permits in private, by what he makes room for near the center, by what he refuses to refuse. From that angle, Solomon's secret worship is not a single hidden rite that can be isolated and described like a crime report. It is a shift in what the king believes is possible. It is the belief that sacred exclusivity can be treated as a public banner, while private life becomes layered and plural. Once a king believes that, the nation learns it. Because ordinary people do not need access to palace corridors to be formed by palace culture. They only need to observe what is honored and what is tolerated. They only need to see which practices carry shame and which carry prestige. If foreign rights become dignified within the orbit of power, then those rights stop feeling like threats. They begin to feel like options, and options are seductive. In a world where life is fragile, where illness can strike without warning, where harvests depend on rains that cannot be controlled, where childbirth carries danger, where war can erase a village, people reach for whatever seems to offer protection. If one sacred language does not feel immediate enough, people will supplement it rather than abandon it. They add, they layer. They keep the temple and also keep the household symbol. They honor the covenant and also seek help at the local shrine. They do not experience this as betrayal. They experience it as survival. The covenant tradition experiences it as fracture. That is why, in later centuries, reform movements speak with urgency. They treat alternative worship sites not as harmless customs, but as breaches that must be closed. They speak as if the land itself cannot sustain divided devotion. They tear down, they remove, they insist. They do this not because they are blind to human need, but because they believe human need must be trained rather than indulged. If fear drives worship, worship becomes a marketplace. If worship becomes a marketplace, the covenant becomes one product among many. A nation cannot keep coherence under that logic for long. Yet even reform does not erase the deeper question. How did divided devotion become normal enough to survive repeated attempts to eliminate it? Here Solomon returns as the most powerful explanation, because his story merges exactly the forces that make normalization possible: royal authority, international entanglement, and the privacy of elite space. A village shrine can be condemned, but it can also be dismissed as rustic ignorance. A shrine tied to royal marriages and diplomatic obligations becomes protected by the same forces that keep the kingdom stable. Condemning it can feel like condemning peace itself. That is how compromise hides. It wraps itself in necessity. The later traditions about Solomon's spiritual reach, stories in which he commands unseen beings, interrogates spirits, wields sacred names as instruments, reflect a culture still wrestling with this problem. They imply a longing for mastery over what threatens identity, whether those threats are foreign powers, foreign cults, or invisible forces of harm. They also imply an anxiety that mastery itself is dangerous. A king who can handle the unseen may begin to believe he can handle anything. He may treat boundaries as challenges rather than safeguards. In that sense, the darker Solomon traditions do not contradict the canonical warning. They intensify it. They take the intuition at the heart of the biblical memory, that wisdom and power can drift into forbidden territory, and expand it into a spiritual drama suited to later audiences. The details change, but the moral gravity remains. The same king who was gifted beyond others still found ways to compromise what should have been absolute. Historical reconstruction, however, asks a harder question beneath all moral storytelling. What is most plausible about Solomon's religious world? It is plausible that Solomon's court was international and cosmopolitan, because the very logic of state building in that era requires networks. It is plausible that royal marriages functioned as diplomacy, and that diplomacy carried religious expectations. It is plausible that Jerusalem's elite culture would have been more exposed to foreign rites than the countryside, not less. It is plausible that private devotional spaces existed within royal compounds, because palaces are built for privacy and controlled access. It is plausible that local shrines persisted in the land, because centralization is always incomplete, especially in early phases of state formation. All of that fits the environment without requiring sensational inventions. What cannot be reconstructed with certainty is the precise form of any secret worship Solomon may have practiced. The tradition's moral focus is not on ritual choreography, but on loyalty. It does not invite the reader to imagine a detailed hidden liturgy. It invites the reader to imagine a divided heart. And in the logic of covenant history, a divided heart is enough. Because the consequences described are not magical punishments. They are structural. A kingdom built on a sacred claim cannot remain stable when the sacred claim becomes negotiable at the center. Political division follows spiritual division not as lightning from heaven, but as the natural result of a people losing a shared inner boundary. Once the boundary is blurred, everything becomes easier to justify. The king justifies private shrines as diplomacy. Officials justify participation as cultural respect. The people justify local rights as practical help. Each justification is reasonable in isolation. Together, they create a nation that still speaks the language of exclusive devotion while living as if devotion is plural. That is the most haunting possibility Solomon's story forces into the open. Not that a great king fell into obvious rebellion, but that a great king, in the name of peace, love, and wisdom, taught a covenant people how to keep the temple shining while quietly learning to trust other names in the dark. By the time Solomon's memory hardened into national warning, the question had shifted from gossip to theology, from palace rumor to the meaning of Israel itself. People were no longer asking only what one king did in private. They were asking how a covenant people could carry a shining sanctuary at its center and still become vulnerable to the gods of its neighbors. That question is where history becomes most uncomfortable, because it forces attention away from sensational images and toward ordinary mechanisms. Religious change rarely begins with thunder. It begins with habit. In Solomon's world, habit was formed by proximity. A royal household was a dense ecosystem of servants, officials, artisans, guards, and foreign attendants. It contained private kitchens and courtyards, storerooms and terraces, places where incense could be burned without public announcement, places where a ritual specialist could perform words and gestures that never reached the ears of pilgrims in the temple courts. If a foreign queen wished to keep her ancestral devotions, the architecture of power could make it possible without turning it into a public crisis. This is one reason the biblical accusation chooses the language of building. To build is to shift a habit into a structure. It turns a private comfort into a social fact. It takes what might have remained a household custom and plants it into the landscape as something others can see, something that can endure beyond the emotions of a single marriage. A shrine near Jerusalem is not merely a concession to a spouse. It is an announcement that the king's world is larger than the temple's exclusivity. Yet even here, the old tradition is careful in what it does and does not say. It does not depict Solomon standing in the temple and renouncing Israel's God. It depicts him continuing the outward life of worship while his inner loyalty softens. That is the scandal. Devotion divided without the public symbol collapsing. It is possible to maintain the liturgy while surrendering the boundary. To understand what secret worship might have meant in practice, it helps to remember that ancient worship was rarely abstract philosophy. It was embodied attention. A god was honored with food, smoke, rhythm, and space. Offerings and feasts created social bonds. Incense made the air feel inhabited. Lamps and oil shaped the night into a sacred environment. Vows and blessings tied the unseen to the daily. Many rites were domestic rather than monumental, performed not by priests in ornate spaces, but by household leaders who believed a gesture could keep disaster away. In the royal sphere, such rites could be both personal and political. A queen's devotion could be framed as a symbol of alliance, a sign that her homeland's dignity was respected, that the treaty was not merely ink but honor. A king could permit a shrine not because he had fallen in love with a foreign deity, but because he had fallen in love with stability. In that kind of calculation, worship becomes a diplomatic language. It is a way of saying, without words, that the kingdom of Israel can coexist with other sacred powers, rather than confronting them. The covenant tradition refuses that language. It treats it as a betrayal precisely because it is plausible. If betrayal arrived only as an obvious scandal, it would be easy to avoid. The tradition insists the danger is subtler, the turning of the heart through reasonable decisions. The names attached to Solomon's compromise, as preserved in biblical memory, point to real religious worlds. Coastal cults tied to fertility and royal patronage. Highland deities tied to national identity and war. Border gods whose worship was entangled with the politics of neighboring peoples. Each name functions like a geographic marker. They map Israel's alliances, its anxieties, its temptations. And then there is the darkest edge of the memory, the association of certain foreign rites with offerings that later writers treat as abominations. Here a modern reader must move carefully. Ancient polemic can exaggerate. Later reformers, looking back through catastrophe, could sharpen accusations to make moral points. Yet it would be equally naive to assume all such accusations were invented. The ancient Near East was a world where extreme offerings were not unimaginable, and where some communities believed that in moments of terror, a god could be appeased by what was most precious. The covenant tradition places a hard moral boundary here. It insists that devotion is not only about which divine name is honored, but about what kind of moral universe a community inhabits. If a king legitimizes foreign worship, he risks legitimizing foreign moral logic as well. Even if the most extreme practices never occurred in Solomon's reign, the fear behind the condemnation is clear. Once you grant space to rival sacred systems, you no longer control where the boundary ends. This is where scholarly reconstruction becomes both illuminating and limited. It can explain mechanisms, contexts, and plausibilities. It can show that royal households often hosted multiple cultic practices across the ancient world. It can show that local shrines persisted because centralization is difficult, especially early in state formation. It can show that material culture points to a lived religious world more layered than official ideals. It can even show that later reformers had strong incentives to frame the past in moral patterns. But reconstruction cannot place a single ritual back into Solomon's hands and say with certainty, this is what he did in the dark. And perhaps that is the point. The biblical narrative is not designed to satisfy curiosity about private choreography. It is designed to expose a spiritual principle. Power can maintain public holiness while privately renegotiating what holiness means. That renegotiation is the real secret. It happens when a king begins to treat the covenant like policy rather than like identity. It happens when the temple becomes a national emblem rather than a boundary that disciplines the ruler. It happens when worship becomes a tool for stability instead of a refusal that can cost stability. Once that shift takes place, everything becomes easier to justify. A shrine becomes an act of tolerance. A tolerated rite becomes an act of sophistication. Sophistication becomes an act of wisdom. Wisdom becomes a shield against criticism. And a shield against criticism becomes a shield against repentance. Later generations, standing in the ruins of their own certainties, looked back and saw this sequence with painful clarity. They did not merely blame Solomon for an error. They treated him as the prototype of a particular kind of fall. Not the fall of ignorance, but the fall of brilliance that believes it can negotiate what should be absolute. This is why Solomon's legend splits into two currents that seem opposed, yet belong to the same anxiety. In one current, he is the compromised king, seduced by love and politics into honoring rival powers. In the other, he is the master of hidden forces, wielding sacred names as instruments, commanding spirits, extracting secrets from the unseen. One portrait condemns him for accommodating other powers. The other portrait imagines him dominating them, but both portraits revolve around the same theme: a king who stands too close to boundaries and assumes he can control the result. That assumption is what the covenant tradition calls folly, even when it wears the face of wisdom. Because the unseen cannot be domesticated by calculation. Neither can loyalty. A covenant cannot be balanced like trade accounts. It can only be kept or broken. When later reformers looked at the landscape of their own time, shrines scattered, household devotions layered, sacred language used alongside practices they considered foreign, they did not treat it as a neutral diversity. They treated it as the outcome of a long drift that began when the center gave permission. They believed the disease had entered through the palace, where privacy and power could protect compromise from scrutiny. In that worldview, Solomon's secret worship is the origin not because it was the first foreign rite ever practiced in the land, but because it was the first time the nation's highest authority made divided devotion respectable. Respectability is the turning point. Once a practice is respectable, it becomes transmissible. It becomes something a child can grow up seeing without shock. It becomes part of what a person assumes is normal for the successful, the educated, the elite. And once the elite normalize it, the covenant ideal begins to feel like an older, stricter voice, still honored, still sung, but increasingly treated as impractical. Impractical is how a covenant dies in a prosperous age. Then crisis arrives, and the nation discovers that what felt practical has hollowed out the inner bond that could have held it together. This is the shadow Solomon leaves behind. Not the image of a king openly abandoning his God, but the image of a king who kept the sanctuary shining while teaching the kingdom that devotion could be plural if it served peace. The temple stood. The songs continued. And somewhere near the center, under the shelter of royal permission, the covenant's exclusivity learned to share the air with other names. The final judgment on Solomon in Israel's memory is not delivered in the language of architecture, but in the language of consequence. The tradition does not end by listing the dimensions of the temple or the weight of gold in the treasury. It ends by tracing a line, quiet at first, then unmistakable, between a divided heart and a divided kingdom. That line is the meaning of the story. Solomon's reign begins with the kind of scene that later generations longed to return to. A king who speaks to God with humility, who asks for discernment rather than conquest, who receives wisdom as if it were a sacred fire placed inside the mind. The temple then rises as the public embodiment of that gift. A people who once carried holiness in a portable tent now sees holiness anchored in stone. The sacred center becomes visible, permanent, and dazzling. But then the world presses in. It presses in through diplomacy, through trade, through the glitter of international prestige, through the human tenderness of marriage, the loneliness of foreign queens, the politeness that keeps alliances warm. It presses in through the ancient reality that kings are never only husbands and never only worshippers. They are always also managers of anxiety, persuaders of rivals, hosts to dangerous guests. Solomon becomes great at hosting, and hosting becomes his undoing, because what he hosts is not only foreign luxury and foreign language. He hosts foreign sacred worlds. Even if he tells himself it is harmless, even if he frames it as private courtesy, even if he insists the temple remains untouched, the hosting changes the atmosphere around the center. It creates sacred alternatives within the orbit of power. It normalizes the idea that devotion can be layered, negotiated, expanded like a treaty network. The covenant tradition insists that this is where the turning happens. Not when the temple is abandoned, but when it is reduced to a symbol that no longer disciplines the heart of kingship. A symbol without discipline becomes decoration, and decoration can be used. This is why Israel's later writers treat Solomon's compromise as more than a personal failure. They treat it as the opening of a door through which the entire nation would eventually walk, often without realizing it. Once the court makes room for rival devotions, the people learn that room can be made. Once divided worship becomes respectable at the center, it becomes plausible everywhere. The temple's songs still rise, but they rise into air now shared with other names. The tragedy is not that Israel suddenly forgets its God. The tragedy is that Israel learns to speak of its God as one protector among many. The language of covenant, which demanded a singular loyalty, becomes the language of heritage, honored but no longer absolute. The people keep festivals, keep prayers, keep the memory of the Exodus and the promises, while also adopting rituals that feel practical, immediate, comforting in fear. That is not how devotion dies loudly. That is how devotion is diluted. Archaeology, the study of ancient texts, and the broader history of the region all confirm the plausibility of that dilution as a social process. The ancient Near East was not a world of tidy religious borders. It was a world of layered practice, household ritual, local shrines, and overlapping sacred symbols. Israel's covenant tradition stood against that world with unusual intensity, insisting on a kind of exclusivity that was always under pressure. The pressure did not end with Solomon. It increased. After the kingdom split, sacred centers multiplied. Worship became even more entangled with political legitimacy. Local shrines persisted, sometimes devoted to Israel's God outside Jerusalem's control, sometimes hosting blended rites, sometimes serving as the spiritual signature of rival regimes. Reform movements arose in response, tearing down unauthorized altars, removing cult objects, and trying to restore the exclusive claim of the central sanctuary. These reforms, remembered with passion, testify to the scale of the struggle. A community does not fight so hard unless it believes it is fighting for survival. In that struggle, Solomon's memory became both the wound and the warning. Later, Jewish and early Christian traditions expanded the warning into a mythic register, imagining Solomon as a man who could command hidden powers, bind spirits, and wield sacred names like instruments. Those texts do not give reliable access to Solomon's actual Iron Age practices, but they reveal a long cultural unease. The suspicion that extraordinary wisdom can drift toward forbidden mastery, that the desire to control what is unseen can blur the boundary between divine gift and human overreach. Whether the story is told as compromise or as command, the theme remains. Solomon stands too close to what should not be handled casually, and he assumes he can remain unchanged. The canonical memory says he did not, and then it shows the consequence as history rather than magic. When Solomon dies, the seams tear. The people who had carried the weight of his building projects and tribute systems now demand relief. The new king answers poorly. Political resentment ignites. The tribes split. Rival capitals rise. Competing sanctuaries become tools of legitimacy. The nation's unity collapses into two kingdoms that will later be swallowed by larger empires. The tradition frames this collapse as judgment, but its judgment is not presented as arbitrary. It is presented as the natural outcome of a fractured center. A kingdom built on an exclusive sacred claim cannot remain coherent when its own king teaches it to live with sacred alternatives. In this sense, Solomon's secret worship is the origin story of a disaster that looks political on the surface, but is interpreted as spiritual at its root. What makes this ending powerful is its refusal to comfort the listener with simple villains. Solomon is not remembered as a monster. He is remembered as brilliant, favored, capable of prayer, capable of building the house that became the most sacred symbol in Israel's life. That is why his fall matters. It proves that spiritual danger is not reserved for the ignorant. It comes for the gifted. It comes for the sophisticated. It comes for the ones who believe their wisdom can balance what others must refuse. The temple remains his masterpiece. It is also his indictment, because it stands as a reminder that the greatest sacred symbol can be constructed by hands that are already learning to compromise the loyalty it was meant to guard. A nation can shine outwardly while fraying inwardly. A sanctuary can remain active while the heart of power becomes plural. The songs can rise while private altars teach a different lesson. Solomon's hidden worship, then, is not finally about the precise rites performed in guarded spaces. It is about what happens when a people learns, through the example of its most successful king, that the covenant can be treated as one allegiance among several, rather than the allegiance that defines everything else. That lesson does not destroy a nation overnight. It only makes the nation easier to divide, and when division comes, the stones of the temple still gleam for a while in the sun, beautiful, silent, unable to hold together what the heart of kingship has already allowed to split.